business meeting. We do have an agenda, but I'm going to really mess with it. So hold on one second. Let me get everybody at their places. Trying to get us caught back up. All right, so I'd like to convene the business session of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. Behind in your briefing books, you have a tab for the business session. We have an agenda and our proceedings from October. If you'll give me the flexibility to add some issues under other business that include the executive committee meeting, small coastal sharks, and endangered sea turtles. Is there any other business that would to be placed on the agenda of the business meeting? Tom?
No, I think you should point out to people why the business meeting is different than the policy board and what the members. The members are only the 15 states, not the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Marine Fisheries Service, or the Potomac River on the business side. A lot of people didn't know that. So I just want to remind you what the business meeting is of the full commission.
Oh, thank you, Tom. All right, so actually, I'll go to the public to see if anyone from the public would like to address the full commission. Seeing no hands, we'll move right into our first item of business, and that is consider approval of a policy on the Commissioner's financial disclosure and conflict of interest. The Executive Committee met this morning and had a very good discussion, I believe, on the Commission's conflict of interest policy. And we basically were looking at we had three primary issues that we wanted to discuss. The first was the definition of conflict of interest. What we basically were looking at were four general provisions that dealt with folks having greater than 10% interest in the total harvest of a fishery under consideration by the Commission, 10% interest in the marketing or processing of the total harvest, has a full or partial ownership of more than 10% of the vessels used in the fishery, and an employee or representative of a harvesting entity that harvests greater than 10% of the total harvest of the fishery. Those we all agreed to were the four categories of circumstances that would result in a conflict of interest. We had also considered two additional ones: is an employee or representative of an environmental organization involved in fisheries-related issues. We elected to strike that as being a potential for conflict of interest. And we also did not believe that just because somebody derives a certain percentage of their income from the fishery under consideration that they should be excluded from participating at the board level. So the Executive Committee recommends that the 10% criteria be used to define a conflict of interest. The next issue, which I'm going to actually go to the third issue first, and that's the definition of a minor child. We had three definitions to look at. Does everybody have this?
Yeah, we've just passed out.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. Just realized maybe y'all hadn't seen this. All right, so if you turn the page under definition of a minor child, everybody agreed with number one. There was really no discussion or deliberation under that other than just everybody agreed that number one was the way to go. Yes, sir.
Are you asking a question or are you making?
No, I'm making a statement. This is I'm giving you the XCOM report on that issue. So we all believe that number one was the way to go. So where we got partially wrapped around the axle, but then also had several commenters say that really this should be discussed at the full business meeting, was on option issue number 2. And we eliminated options 3 and 4. And one of the reasons that I believe we were, at least I think all but one of us was comfortable removing 3 and 4 was the recognition that 6, we did not agree to move forward with number 6 in the definition of conflict of interest. So it really limits the opportunity for a commissioner to even have a conflict of interest with just numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4 included in the definition. So the big question, the big issue that we have to decide right now is, are you comfortable with 1, 2, 3, and 4? Are you comfortable with number 1 on the definition of a minor child? And what I'd like to do now is ask for, Spud is going to provide comments on issue number 2, number 1, and then who was going to discuss, and then Dennis will discuss issue number 2, and then we will have discussion on those 2 options and hopefully a motion to adopt that as our conflict of interest policies. So with that, I'll first ask Spud if he's ready to make his comments on item 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am ready. I want to speak in support of option 1 under issue 2, because I believe if the purpose of this policy is to ensure that the public and other commissioners have confidence that an individual that has been deemed to have a conflict of interest is not involved at all in the deliberations leading to a decision that affects a fisheries management option, the way to ensure that is to have them remove themselves from the process as much as possible. And option 1 does that. That has that individual step away from the table, be part of the public. They still have the opportunity to speak to the topic from the perspective of a member of the public, but not as a member of their delegation. And a couple of things that I believe are important is that we do vote as a delegation, and we sit in physical proximity to each other. And so I think, from a perception standpoint, if that individual is there shoulder to shoulder with their colleagues in their delegation, then it would be easy for someone to assume that that person has had an influence on that decision that has been rendered by that delegation. So it's for that reason, for the clarity of it. It's as black and white, I think, as you can make it once something like this happens, and we all agree that it's probably going to be a rare event that someone is actually going to be deemed in conflict of interest. But that's the reason I support option number 1.
Thank you, Spud. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me say that I was in favor of option number 4, as that seemed to be where the LJs wanted to go at our last meeting in May. However, listening to all the conversations, it became clear that the majority of the executive committee was concerned about legal scrutiny, and they felt that 1 or 2 kept us in a better position than the other 2 options. I also was in favor of number 2 of the 2 choices, simply that I think that when someone arrives here, they should be able to sit at the table and be part of the discussion, but not part of the voting or making motions. So again, I think that there was some support also for option 2, and that's, I think, when we reached the point where we decided we should bring it to the rest of you folks to see what you had for comments. I think we should keep in mind that it's probably a very rare thing when this will occur that someone has a true conflict of interest. And I think the important thing about the whole matter is that in the first instance, that person has to declare the fact that they do have a conflict of interest. That in itself will lead us to where we should be in number 2. So again, I'm interested to hear what the LGAs have to say about these 2 options.
And anyone else that's not on the executive committee as well. So would that lead in to this issue? Are there comments or a motion on either one? Tom?
It's an interesting situation because if the person is the governor's appointee, the governor's appointee has been appointed by that governor, expects to communicate, as some of you know, I've been told once or twice how to vote from the governor, because that's my job, as the governor basically contacts. And you are now taking the governor's appointee away from the table. You know, I can understand, that's why I'm looking more seriously at 2, because he's put the same thing with the legislative appointee. I mean, that's supposed to be representing the state legislature. So if you're going to put these rules out, and, you know, it's the governor or the legislative of each state signed off on this compact, it's not us signing off on the compact, that maybe we should contact the governors to find out how they feel about the recursion. I know some people look at me like a little crazy, but that's what you're here for. You've been appointed by the governor of your state to represent him at this table. You're not supposed to be representing any other association, but that's your job. And we all have these conflicts of interest when we sit around, except for me, since nobody pays me. But that's, you know, how it basically happens. And so, really, I find this a little difficult with 1, which will make him get up and remove from the table, because then it basically tells the governors that his representative cannot sit at the table. I think that's a big mistake. You want to hold them for voting? Again, it's a caucus vote, so the two people that are not the governors or the legislative appointee, they're going to either outvote them or they're not going to listen to their vote. That's, you know, and that's up for them to decide. But I feel uncomfortable doing that.
Dave?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to start off with a question, but before I do, I'd just like to note, for transparency purposes, yesterday I got elected to be the vice chairman of the Lobster Committee, and I take issue with this 10% and 1, 2, and 3. I think we should lower it down to 1%, and that would eliminate me from being the vice chairman of the committee. No, and it's in a serious note. My issue, I agree with, I thought the discussion at the executive committee was excellent. I thought, in particular, I'd single out Dennis Abbott for making the point that really a conflict of interest, and I probably went 10 times to the Rhode Island Ethics Commission with different individuals and listened to attorneys debate conflict of interest, so I learned a lot just by listening. And the essence of conflict of interest, from my perspective, is that an individual gets a disproportionate benefit or harm from some action. And that was a point that Dennis made at the executive committee. But so the first question is, for number 4, what is the definition of a fishery? And if it's viewed in the context of the lobster fishery, the horseshoe crab fishery, the herring fishery, then I don't have a problem with the definition. So I think that needs to be clarified. If that's what the intent is, I think we need to be clear that it's the entire fishery and not, and I'll use an example so everyone's clear. In the lobster fishery, there are 6 or 7 management areas. You could argue that one of those management areas is within the entire lobster fishery is like a subset, and that the 10% is determined based on that subset. That would give you a completely different result. So it's the entire fishery, correct?
My intent, at least, was that it would include, it would be an FMP.
Yeah. Okay.
So an entire species.
Okay. So
and not divided up into sectors or fisheries. Fisheries meaning like the pound net fishery or the trawl fishery or the gill net fishery, but it's the entire fishery for that species.
Yeah.
And
I think
believe that's
the way I read it, and I think that's the way it makes sense. But I just want to point this out, that this may be problematic. This is not problematic at all. I represent part-time the Atlantic Offshore Lobster Association, and in that capacity, I would not have any problem meeting this criteria the way it's written. But we probably have, if everybody thinks about this for a minute, I bet you can think of examples where we have either a recreational fishing representative or a commercial fishing representative that's going to fall within this. And the commercial example would be one of our most distinguished commissioners was Pat White, did a fabulous job representing the commission. Maine lands 80% of the lobsters in the entire lobster fishery. Pat, I think, represented 2,500 Maine lobstermen. So he clearly, in his capacity as, and I'm just using this as an example, I want to make sure the record is clear, I'm not criticizing him. In his capacity, he clearly was representing more than 10% of the landings, commercial landings, from the entire fishery. Would we want to exclude somebody like Pat because of that requirement? And then the opposite side of the issue is I can think of some of our recreational leaders being in the position where their constituents may harvest more than 10% of a fishery, and would we want to exclude them from participation in the deliberations? And I think, maybe people around the table have different views on that, and I'm happy to listen to them, but if that's what the intent is, I'm not sure it's in the best interest of the commission to use number 4. Maybe we should just limit it to the first 3, and then if this develops into a problem, then further refine it. But I'd like to hear a dialogue on those points. Thank you.
All right, well, we'll like to go back to issue 2 first and have that discussion. And maybe does that influence the way you feel about issue 2, Dave?
Excuse me, about the fishery?
Well, let's see. We'll see if there's comment on. The senator had his hand up, I think. Let's see.
Yes, thank you. I find, as a senator from New York, I don't know much about fisheries. I'm learning, but I do know a lot about ethics. I'm the chairman of the Senate Ethics Committee in New York State. And for those of you who don't know, New York is considered probably one of the most unethical legislatures, so I got a lot of practice. But we do learn in my years in the legislature that you learn from people who know the business and know the area. And whether when we're debating a bill on divorce law, we listen to the matrimonial attorneys. When we're debating something on environment, we listen to people who specialize in environmental issues. And I believe that that's important here to make sure that those people who know the business, they have their certain perspective, obviously, and sometimes as a benefit to themselves or their companies. But you take that into account. And as long as it's disclosed, we know where they're coming from, then we get the information that can help us make a better decision on the issues that we're going to be voting on. I believe that's the best way to move forward.
Thank you very much for that, Senator. So I think I hear the question from Dave. I'd like to get some discussion on that, but I'd like to hold off first until we have more discussion on issue 2 and whether or not the commission wants to take the position that Commissioner Woodward presented or the position that Commissioner Abbott presented. Richie?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also attended the executive committee meeting this morning, and it was great discussion, and it was very helpful. I support number 2. The only addition I would make to that is that there be something in place if the commissioner did not announce that he was recusing himself. So, what happens then? Is it set into place that the board chair then announces it for him? So there's just something that in case he got caught in that kind of situation. But I think it's the fairest. It's the fairest situation to allow a governor or a legislator that wants someone to sit at this table, that the person sit at the table and have the discussion, and then is just eliminated from the voting. So, thank you.
The folks at the executive committee that said that the LGAs would have a different perspective on this were right on the money. So I'm glad we did this. Emerson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fully agree with Senator Boyle in that I think it's very helpful for us to hear from participants in the fishery, and we can learn from them. And further, I would rather hear from those participants with them sitting around the table rather than sitting in the audience. So I prefer number 2.
Robert?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and I'll second your comments. I think this is vital, critical discussion. If you all would indulge me, turn to page 1 of the handout, please, and note the present rule is quoted by the Commission. I'll read it, if I may, Joe. No commissioner shall have a direct or indirect financial interest that conflicts with the fair and impartial conduct of official duties. That is in our rules and regulations today. I'd like to read for you all, if I could, the rule that governs my behavior from the state of South Carolina. All public employees a public official, public member, or public employee may not knowingly use his official office, membership, or employment to influence a government decision to obtain an economic interest for himself, a family member, an individual with whom he is associated, or a business with which he is associated. So that's a very, very high standard, I would argue. It's a prohibition. And I gather that many of the administrative commissioners have very similar statutes or rules governing their conduct as well. So I couple this that governs my behavior as an official of the state of South Carolina with the code of conduct that's listed here on page 1. And I think the issue here is really one of durability of decisions. And the question I have for the Commission is that if we take option 2, which is once recused, the Commissioner will be able to participate in the board section debate, but won't be able to make or second motions. I think many of us all recognize that the ability to make or second motions is critical to deliberations of the body. But there are other ways to influence via discussion the actions of the body. And I think if my colleagues who aren't here from South Carolina were sitting here, they would look at the South Carolina Code and say, we need to be very, very clear and very, very bright about this, and that we don't need to jeopardize the actions, the decisions, the outcomes of this body by being squishy when it comes to these issues. And so for that reason, and I respect the opinions of those who are interested in hearing the discussion and the debate and the valuable input from not only the commissioners but from the advisors. But I think we put ourselves on a very, very dangerous and slippery slope in violating our own rules. And violating our own rules makes us pretty vulnerable to our actions being challenged and those challenges being sustained in a court of law. So I would just ask you all to consider that as we discuss this. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Leroy?
I have a question. I guess it would be for Bob. Under the current code of conduct, is it your feeling that option 2 would be consistent with that code of conduct? And if not, would the code of conduct have to be amended to be able to choose option 2, and what would that process be?
Thanks, Leroy. I think the vagueness of what's included in the code of conduct right now is how this whole dialogue got started. We had some commissioners that folks felt sort of crossed the line of being able to conduct their business in a fair and impartial manner, and then we had some other commissioners that had a financial interest, but the individuals were still able to be fair and impartial. And that's what we're wrestling with, obviously, or you guys are wrestling with. And so, I think the intent of all of this is to really clarify the sentence that Robert read earlier. So if the commissioners feel that the items 1 through 4 or items 1 through 3 of the first issue on defining conflict of interest, if that's how you define the conflict of interest, and then the option 1 or 2 and issue 2, the right combination of those two, I think it's really at the discretion of this group. If they feel comfortable with that outcome, then I think it is consistent with the language here. If commissioners want to change the rules and regulations, there is a process to do that with pre-notification and those sorts of things. But my interpretation is that all of this work and debate at the executive committee and the LGA meetings is leading up to interpreting that one sentence.
Tom?
It's really interesting when you look at that one sentence and then you realize that we had a board that consisted of 5 members of industry and 5 of the states that had that financial interest, and that goes back to the Manhattan board, and that was the whole board that voted on many issues. I didn't think it was right then, and I agree with you at the point we needed to change it. But again, I understand what Robert said, but Robert should understand I'm considered a special officer from the state of New Jersey. That means I fill out this financial disclosure form is a joke compared to what I fill out. It's like 25 pages by the time I fill it out. I also go before the Senate Judiciary Committee to answer any questions they have, and they basically send me after that has to be voted on by the full House of the Senate in New Jersey. That's the process we go through. And then I swear before a judge, and have to send that notarized certificate in, taking the oath before I can be a commissioner. We go through a process to do that. That's how, I don't know if every state's the same way, but that's how New Jersey operates. So you go through a long process where at any time somebody can go to the House Judiciary Committee, somebody can go to the full Senate, and we get appointed supposedly every 3 years. That's kind of been a little crazy lately. But anyway, that's what I'm looking at. And I'm covered up. I can't accept a dinner from any of you guys sitting around a table if my role as a commissioner when I'm sitting here. I have sat down, somebody wanted to buy me a drink, I says, can't do that. Even though we know each other for 30 years, I can buy you a drink, but that's the way it is. So I think we take it seriously, and that's part of our job is taking it seriously. And that's why I says, I feel like 2 handles part of this problem. I can only think of all the present boards, maybe one person that's going to be really affected at this time. And I don't want to make a policy that affects one person that directly. I think it's unfair, because we could look at other people in other ways, and there's been a lot of people who have strong interests and made strong comments because of the people they've represented at this table. But, I think it's a fair way of doing it, sticking with number 2.
Doug?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was one of the executive committee members who was in favor of number 2, and I wanted to make people aware of why I supported this. I certainly understand, our issue here is that a vote might be taken that will be perceived as a person who has a conflict of interest is lined up on under issue number 1 has somehow influenced the decision of the ASMFC here to their benefit. One way to do it, as has been brought forward by Spud and Robert Boyles, is to just remove them completely from the process. My concern with this is that I think that will end up making that commissioner's opinion on this subject less transparent to the public, because I believe that if someone is going to be asked to remove themselves for a conflict of interest, then they will come to different commission members' offices or via phone and try and persuade them that way. And that will not be transparent. If we go with option 2, we still afford them the ability to present their opinion and to persuade us, but we take away their vote. We take away their vote from their delegation, and we take away their vote from the commission. And it's the vote that turns into action here. And so that's my concern here, is I want to make their opinion completely transparent on this, and I'm afraid if we go with number 1 that we'll lose that transparency.
So, there were several other parts of the discussion that occurred at the XCOM. One was related to, I think, Tom's point about a governor or a legislator appointing someone that then would be asked to leave the table. I don't have a problem with that in any way, shape, or form, because I think it's incumbent upon the state to inform the governor that this person has a conflict of interest in a certain fishery, and be aware that if you appoint him to this board, that he's not going to be able to participate in the discussion on that fishery. That's fairly easy, I think. And it is up to this commission to make the rules and regulations that govern our ethics. And so that was discussed at the XCOM, and so I really don't have that as a concern. And that's just me. One vote. So the other point that I thought was good was, and I can't remember who made it, and I'd credit them with it, is they commended Commissioner Grout on the way that he handled the Striped Bass Board meeting yesterday. And he was very cognizant of people going back to the well multiple times. And so there was discussion that if we did go with option 2, then it would be the responsibility of the executive director, if he had a board meeting coming up on a species for which a commissioner had a conflict of interest, to remind the board chairman that he needs to be very cognizant of not allowing that commissioner who is recused under option 2 from dominating the discussion and speaking 8 or 10 times on a single topic. I thought that was a reasonable compromise position for option 2. As long as we all agreed, and we can all run a meeting like Doug runs a meeting. And so I thought that was an important part of the proposal. Another important component of the discussion, I felt, was the fact that once the caucus began, the recused commissioner needs to go away. Wherever they go, I don't know, but they go to the back of the room or they go to the bathroom or do whatever. But to not be sitting there chummy with the rest of the caucus making as the decision was being made. And I thought that was a reasonable request and consideration. But as the chairman of the commission, on this issue, I feel very strongly that they shouldn't participate in the discussion. I don't think they should be involved in the caucus, and I don't believe they should be involved in the discussion. and that the governors and the legislators that appoint somebody needs to recognize that and understand that. In the rare event that we do have a commissioner that has that issue come up, and while we may only be able to think of one person that fits the criteria right now, that person, bless his heart, has caused me and the former chair a lot of effort. I mean, we've met with people. It's created a lot of problems for us in how that's handled, and we've received letters from lawyers over the fact that there was a clear conflict of interest. And so, in my personal opinion, the way that it was handled at the meeting when Mitch sat in the audience and spoke from the public microphone, eels didn't fall off the face of the earth. Everything worked out fine. And Mitch was happy with that decision, and the state of Pennsylvania was happy with that decision, and it worked out great. So, yes, I'm advocating for option one. I think that's my responsibility as the chairman. But again, it will be up. It sounds like the group is leaning more towards option two, and I think if that's the motion that is made and passed, then I would certainly suggest that the caveats that were discussed at the executive committee on limiting the speaking and moving away from the table during the deliberations of the caucus be considered as a part of that option two as well. So, I've said my piece. So if somebody would like to offer a motion, because we're not going to come to consensus on this, that would be great, and we can vote it up or down and discuss it from that point on. Walter?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to offer a motion. On issue one, I move that the board adopt on issue one, items 1, 2, 3, and 4. On issue 2, item 2. And on issue 3, item 1.
Thank you, Representative Kamiga. Second by Mr. Fody. All right. So we have a motion and a second. I don't think we probably need to talk about issue 3, but I would like some.
Would you like to talk about 3?
Who?
Greg Minor.
Oh, Greg Minor. Oh, I'm sorry.
Because
it's a minor child.
As a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, it's not. I was just trying to, I guess, reconcile, in light of the motion, reconcile the passage under the Commissioner's Code of Conduct that speaks about have any direct or indirect financial interest and the establishment of what appears to be a 10% threshold of financial interest. So in supporting this, would it then be your opinion that anything below 10% would not in and of itself create the conflict contemplated in the Code of Conduct?
You can give it a shot.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Now, Craig, my interpretation, and that's all it is that anybody that happens to violate any of the 4 triggers that are included in this motion for issue number 1, definition of a conflict, those are the 4 triggers that indicate the person would have limited ability to conduct themselves in a fair and impartial manner. If they don't violate those, then there's a fair level of confidence that those folks could conduct themselves in a fair and impartial way when they're going about commission business. So that would be the difference, or that would be my read on how we've defined conflict of interest. Anything below the 10% threshold is okay and is not causing fair and impartial participation.
And so one of the things that I've learned being here now for a little while is that some of these species have a direct relationship to others. So, for instance, if I were owner of an industry that used another species as bait, yet that wasn't my forte. Would I be, if I reached that threshold of 10%, let's say I own 20% of the lobster fishery in Connecticut, and that fishery used the other species as bait, would I be conflicted out of that other conversation, even though that is almost as important as any vote we might take on the size of lobster, for instance?
I don't believe so, no. And it wouldn't matter if you could have a 20% interest in the Connecticut fishery. That wouldn't be a problem. A 10% interest in the Connecticut fishery. It would be the entire lobster fishery for the entire East Coast. And you'd be something if you had a 10% interest in menhaden and
right. No, but
lobster.
my point is that, I guess my point here is, and I don't mean to be cute, is that this is not, it may not be as kind of simple as we're making it. I mean, I think the point that was being made about, if you have any direct or indirect financial interest that might create a conflict, I'm not sure that establishing a threshold eliminates this problem. Let me just say that up front. I also, respect the point that was made. You can either, do this here in public, or you can, have those conversations in private. And what have we gained? So this is not an easy, subject, I guess, for us to deal with. And I'm willing to try and move forward and reach a resolution. But I just wanted to know whether. So my understanding is then, if an individual does not reach that 10%, and I'll use the word threshold rather than violate, because I'd like to think it's not a violation. It's a recognition that that's a threshold that we are going to establish, at which a reasonable person might consider your involvement to be a conflict. So if you don't hit that 10% threshold, it would be reasonably understood that this body would not take someone to task for participating in that conversation because they hadn't hit that trigger.
That would be my understanding, but also if you consider the motion in its total, then I think it removes a lot of the concerns there, because they would still be able to participate in the discussion and the debate, albeit hopefully in a limited fashion from the chairman of the board. And I think that may address Dave Borden's concern about number 4, in that a commissioner like Pat White that may represent more than 10%, we're not losing his counsel on the issues and ideas that come before the board. He just can't vote on it. And so
thank you.
That may help relieve some of your angst about that, based on the motion that's on the floor at this time. Jim Gilmore, and then Robert Boyles, and then Bob Ballou.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. 2 points. First, remember with the discussion we had this morning, I don't know if it was clear, is that 10% threshold, we're following some of the council procedures from the federal government. So there is at least some legal advice from the federal government, and they've been dealing with this longer. So we didn't pull that number out of the air. Secondly, and I think Louis made this point this morning, which I thought really struck a nerve with me, was that remember, there's 45 commissioners around the table, and then if you've got one commissioner in one state that's maybe participating, but then he's not even allowed to caucus, I really can't imagine, I think Louis put it, that individual would be it would be amazing that could have that much influence to convince 45 people to change their minds. So there's a lot of, buffer built into this whole thing in terms of that happening. So I think the minimal risk of having that person at the table to at least bring information to the state caucus, because that's why he was appointed in the first place, I think is helpful, and I really think it's mitigated by the fact that he can't participate in voting. And again, I think if you could influence that many commissioners, you shouldn't be on this commission. You should be making a lot more money. Thank you.
I actually had Dennis's hand before anybody else's, so I'm going to go to Dennis first, and then I'll go to Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we have to realize, we know that part of why we're doing this is for legal protection. At least I think that's one of the aims here. And then we turn around and we depend on each individual to declare himself. the commission really doesn't have the ability to determine whether somebody has 10% or 15% or 5%. So I think once the individual makes the declaration either that he doesn't have a conflict or he does have a conflict, it puts the commission in a good position. So when we get to the working part of it, number 2 works good enough at this point for us to move forward. So I'd like to support the motion.
Robert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go back to something Jim said. Jim, you're right. I think if one person can influence the outcome of a fishery management decision among 45, they probably don't need to be here. But I would caution us to think about the perception of one person sitting at the table, participating in the discussion, whether by making motions or not. That one person may give the motivation to a plaintiff, to an aggrieved party outside. And as I said before, my earlier comments, my interests are in durable decision making. And I just think this is a very, very slippery slope. I think this is something that another point to Representative Minor's point, in South Carolina the threshold is very high or very low. I don't know how you talk about it, but I could foresee some of my fellow commissioners from South Carolina not breaking the 10% threshold. And so we're all good according to issue 1 as it's laid out there. But I think a case could be made, perhaps a situation could arise where they are vulnerable to an ethics violation back home because they're here acting in an official capacity. Again, I didn't explain that very well, but I think that for those of you who, I'd just like for you to just think about that for a moment, that we could have folks acting in a capacity as a commissioner and not violate the rules as we establish, presumably today, but could be vulnerable, culpable for violations back home. So I just urge you all to consider those things as we move forward. Thank you.
Bob Ballou?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I just want to acknowledge the very thoughtful discussion that's taken place both at the Executive Committee meeting and here at this board meeting on this very important issue. Second, I want to note my inclination to support issue 1, or I guess it's item 1 under issue 2, but with the caveat, and this is because I've been strongly influenced by the comments today about the inappropriateness of completely removing a commissioner from the process. That phrase has been used several times. I do not think that is appropriate. And so for me, if item 1 under issue 2 were amended, and this is in the second sentence, which is at the top of page 2, were amended to read that the legislative commissioner, governor appointee, or proxy will be afforded the opportunity to comment from the public microphone when recognized, and then the rest of that sentence, it becomes a sort of a distinction without much of a difference, because the commissioner would be afforded the very same opportunity at that end of the table that he or she would be otherwise afforded at some other place at the table to comment on the matter before the full commission, but they would be doing so from a well-defined position, having declared their conflict of interest. I say well-defined, I mean geographically well-defined. And so for me, that, as opposed to sitting with the caucus, so the delegation, I should say. So for that reason, I would support the an amended version of item 1. Robert Boyle spoke very eloquently on my reasoning for why I support that. Thank you.
Thank you. Emerson.
Thank you. Thank you. I had a question, and I don't know if it came up in the discussion this morning or not. In some fisheries, it will make a difference, and some it won't. The 10% interest, is that based on pounds landed or value or either one?
Pounds. I'd say pounds. This is total harvest. One other real quick point that was made, not trying to influence the decision, but I believe it was Spud that brought up the difference when we start comparing our ethics rules to the council's. The point was made that at the council level, you have an individual vote, whereas at the commission, you're part of a caucus of votes. So there is a distinction there. I believe we felt there was a distinction there. Who else? I have Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For those of you who participated in the various LGA meetings would know I had a strong support for item 3 on issue 2, not asking that person to not be able to deliberate at all. It's very clear that the position of this board is not in favor of that, so I won't even continue to pursue that. But I will continue to support then item 2, and I would just offer that the narrative that you offered, Mr. Chairman, about how the most recent issue that basically generated this discussion was addressed. And I would go back to the Commissioner Code of Conduct, and that the Executive Committee shall have the authority to consider these allegations of breaches. And it sounds to me that between the committee and the chair, they did exactly that. And they came to an acceptable resolution on the matter for the representative in question, his home state, as well as in the best interests of that management board. So I would offer that in that issue, in the absence of any clarification of the Commissioner Code of Conduct, this commission was effective in achieving a reasonable outcome in that scenario. So to therefore further make the restrictions even more so than what they are already, I believe item 2 takes us far enough and would not support anything more restrictive than that. And I hope that the LGAs around the room who supported that in our discussions will continue to support that here today. Thank you.
Lauren?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sometimes it's wise to ponder the main argument of your critic, or in this case, our critic, because there very well may be a nugget of truth there that we have to grapple with. I believe that our critics will indeed focus on point 6, or item number 6 under issue number 1, and object to the fact that we did not grapple with that at all. Perhaps we need to grapple with that as an important measure of our consideration. Thank you.
Dave Borden?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to belabor this, but I'd go back to the point that was made 2 comments ago, that a number of chairmen over the past 25 years had to deal with this, and myself included, and I think without exception, the way that chairmen have handled it, it's been pretty appropriate. In other words, they've taken the individual, they've talked to the other commissioners, solicited input on it, and then basically approached the individual and decided on a course of action. Given that kind of history on this, is it necessary to actually take this as a all or nothing proposal? In other words, the debate is over these 2 alternatives. Both have merits, and they've been good arguments presented. Why not just adopt both of them and say that the executive director and the chairman will select one of these alternatives given the situation at the time, and then advise the individual with a conflict of interest? In other words, that would be a different way. It's a way to get by this vote, because we obviously have very different views around the table, but I just simply point out that there are going to be individual circumstances that will weigh heavily on any determination, and maybe we should give the future chairman and our executive director the option of picking between these 2 as to whether or not it handles the situation. Thank you. And I won't comment further.
I won't let you. That's a very interesting concept. that does have, I can see it having, it's hard to, with 45 commissioners, just the 45 commissioners that are around this table, we're all very different. And we may be able to handle one person differently than we might handle somebody else. So I think that's a very intriguing comment from Commissioner Borden. Leroy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The problem I have with that idea is that I don't think it assures that people are treated the same. It certainly won't. And I'm concerned with that perception. And it puts a lot of pressure on the chairman to make that kind of a decision.
We can handle it. All right, there is. Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question about the actual motion that's on the table here pertaining to issue 2, item 2. If someone has reached the point where they have achieved this conflict of interest status here, I understand completely here not being able to make a motion or a second, but does this motion include a prohibition on participating in a state caucus to influence the state's vote?
Yeah, it says that in option 2, it indicates once recused will be able to participate in the board section debate, but will not be able to make or second motions on the issue. It also says that you're recusing him or herself from participating in the caucus on voting.
I'm sorry, my draft doesn't have that.
Oh,
I
I'm sorry.
understand. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Representative Minor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, to Lauren's point, by eliminating number 6 from our consideration, to go back and use my example, so if I was a lobsterman in Connecticut and my personal income was $250,000 and I was a governor or legislative appointee to this commission, and that did not reach the threshold of 10%, I can sit and debate and negotiate with the rest of the commissioners within the caucus of Connecticut, and that's of no consequence. It's not considered a conflict.
That would be correct.
It's a great place, this America.
Isn't it, though?
Well, I say that in jest. I'm not sure it is. I mean, I'm not sure how you can consider something at some threshold just by representation to be a conflict, yet my personal interest. I can tell you if I had that kind of personal interest on my state financial disclosure form, I'd have a pretty serious problem. So I'm concerned about eliminating that from consideration, I guess. I'm not sure what the number is. I'm not sure how you get there, but I mean, if you want to talk about a conflict, I think people who are critical of people for a conflict might find that one. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Brandon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of points. One, to that last point, I think one thing that we haven't really talked about, this providing the information on where your income comes from and what sort of organizations you're involved with has never been provided by commissioners before, and that's what this document is doing, and that will be available for the public to see. So that information is going to be available for the public to see whether or not they have any sort of, financial ties to any particular industry. So I do think that is a good step so that people can actually see that and make their own determination on that without dealing with this threshold particular issue. So I think that's a good something to clarify. And then just 2 points to the motion, I think. One on issue 2, item 2, do we need to have in that language, Chairman, that you had talked about, that clarification that the number of times that someone might be called upon and that they will remove themselves from the seat during the vote? I don't know if that needs to be added in there or if that's just going to be understood. And then lastly, on the 4 criteria, under issue 1, do we need to put or in there? It's not that you need to meet all four of those things. It's an or. You meet one of those and you are in conflict. So it doesn't say that anywhere, at least that I can tell. It's an or. It's not an and.
Yeah, I think if there's no objection from the motion maker, we can clarify that language, Brandon. I think that's a good point. As far as the direction to the executive director to discuss with the board chair if there's a commissioner with a conflict of interest, I think we can order that outside the motion. And then a reminder that if this motion passes, it would be the intent of the commission to have the person remove themselves from the caucus when the voting occurs, unless there's objection to those provisions of the option. So we've beat this to death. If there's Terry, you haven't spoken on this.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief, and I just want to address the concern for not including item 6 in issue 1, and that is specifically, and I'll take as an example my fellow commissioner from Maine, Steve Train, who's not here today because he's gone back to haul his traps. With any percentage of participation in the industry, we would not be able to draw upon his interest to participate in skills and knowledge to participate on the lobster board. The differentiation I see would be him or at least the main caucus working with him to recuse himself if there's going to be an individual benefit to him. But I think this commission and the board in general benefits from the expertise that a number of our industry members provide in all of our different boards.
Any more comments? Last comment, Bill Goldsboro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think another small edit is necessary. Actually, I think it's correcting a typo in issue 2, item 2, in the language that you read in response to John Bull's question. She is recusing himself or herself from participating in the caucus on voting. I think that should be or voting. Participating in the caucus and voting are two different things. And in the caucus on voting makes no sense.
Well, I guess I see it differently. I guess I see it as the caucus on voting is the caucus. When I say, or when a chairman says, do we caucus? Do you need a caucus? And at that point, we caucus with our individuals. And that's the point in time when the caucus, going to take a caucus, that's when you get up and leave if you have a conflict of interest. It does specifically state that you can participate in your caucus's discussion, if we want to call it a caucus. But in your delegation's 3 membership, you would be able to deliberate on the issues per the motion, just not participate in the caucus on voting. That made sense to me. Walter?
Should the word be and? Because or could be either or, and is understood to be both. And I think that's our intent.
How about in the caucus prior to a vote? Otherwise,
you also need to put the vote. Needs to be understood that it's caucusing and voting. I mean, what if there's no caucus? What if the other 2 commissioners happen to be out of the room?
Yeah, that's good. Now that does create a problem. So it should be and. Caucus and voting. Good point. All right, that's it. We will caucus.
And if you've got a conflict, don't vote.
And if you have a conflict, get out. 30 seconds. We're doing a roll call vote. Individual roll call vote. You're not going to be able to hide behind your caucus. All right. How about all those in favor of the motion signify by raising your right hand? All those opposed, same sign. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I voted.
You voted?
I voted no. No. 1. Abstentions, you can't abstain from this one. Not allowed. Null. 1 null vote. So the motion carries 8 to 6 to 1. So we'll see how it works. All right. That's it for that issue. All right. Now I would like to quickly, because I thought I was going to get us back on track, but I'm glad we did that, and see how much fun we have at XCOM. I mean, it really would behoove folks to come to those now, because, I mean, from Paul's leadership now into mine, we're really taking the executive committee meetings seriously. There's a lot of good discussion that goes on there. It's not a closed meeting, and so anybody and everybody on the commission is welcome to attend those meetings. I can't promise you how much interaction you may have, but at least so far it's gone well with those commissioners that have attended, unless I kick them out inadvertently, which I shouldn't have done. Spud.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the discussion on this, and I look forward to the next topic, which I believe is going to be commissioner grooming standards. Is going to be our next topic we embrace, so I look forward to that discussion too.
Ooh, that's a rough one. I don't know where I would fit there. All right, I got to find the right agenda here. We had several items at the executive committee meeting that we did not go through, that we did not get to, and so at one point, as soon as we can, I'd like to get through that. But I would like to go over. We had some discussion on the use of meeting-specific proxies. And we all kind of agreed that, the intent and purpose behind a governor's appointee is to have a governor's appointee, a legislative appointee, and an administrative commissioner. That commissioners shouldn't be stacking the deck. One of the examples given was, Paul Diodati may ask David Pierce and Gary Nelson to be the commission members for the state of Maine, and then I would bring in Michelle and Laura Lee, and we would end up having dueling state directors and staff, et cetera, et cetera. So there was just a gentleman's agreement and discussion about meeting specific proxies and trying to keep those as intended, which is having different representatives from the industry as well as from the state agency. What constitutes a two-thirds vote with regard to the services abstaining? We had a good discussion on that issue because, and one of the things that had come up was the dogfish meeting on allocation. Traditionally, the services have abstained from voting on allocation issues. In that instance, they abstained, and essentially an abstention counted as a vote. And of a no vote. And so that motion failed. The two-thirds majority motion failed because the services abstained. But I think the point was made that they voted the first time, and so their votes should count the second time. And I think there was general agreement from the executive committee that we not address that issue remain status quo, and that we not address that issue at this time. Oh, yeah, we want a white paper on it, too, to kind of discuss some various options. Sorry about that. I forgot that part. The technical group guidelines on consensus building, we discussed that. We have just recently come out with a policy where the technical committees are going to operate under consensus. We've kind of changed our mind and recommend that we go back to voting at the advisory committee at the technical committee meetings, that they be allowed to provide a minority report if they would like to, but that part of the allure of the technical committees is the vote, and so we need to promote that and have direct. We did not get advice at Striped Bass because there was not consensus, and that's a problem. So the XCOM believes that we should return to voting on issues in front of the technical committee. Was there, Doug, please?
One thing I wanted to bring up is this is going to require a change to some of our policy documents, correct? And one of the things that I still think, and it was brought up at executive committee, that the technical committees should still strive to reach a consensus. But if they cannot, then we're going to take a vote.
Correct.
Because that's still the preferred way, because we want to have one opinion on what science is, the best science is, if possible. So that's just one little, I wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thank you for that clarification, and that was agreed upon by the executive committee that statement be in there as well. Tom, you have something on that?
Yeah, I've had a concern when you basically do all your technical committee meetings on conference calls. Because some people, when they're on the call, they'll voice up, and some people, like me, get to be a phone hog, and we shut other people out. I think when we should try, especially when we're doing a major amendment or something like that, that we really get the technical committee together. I think it's important. Conference calls are good, but it's not like sitting around a table. In my early years in the 90s, I used to go to all the technical committee meetings, so I wanted to figure out what we were doing and how it operated. I understood the rules as the governor's appointee. I'm just sitting in the audience listening. But it was interesting how much got decided, how much talk, how models got straightened out, how they went to dinner, they talked all night at dinner, how things done. And you can't do that on a 2-hour, 3-hour, or even a 4-hour conference call. The whole behavior is different. The governor's appointees most of the time are not notified. I don't get a notification by email that they're going to have a conference call. We would be able to go and sit and listen if we want, pay our own expense, go up there and hear what's going on. But we can't do that if we don't know about it, or there's no way of us getting on the conference call. Not to talk, you can put us on mute, but to understand what the deliberations are, so we have a better feel when we come to the table. If you have the will to sit there 4 hours listening to a conference call. But I think that should be available to that. The other one, and it was along the same lines, is we started doing all these little subcommittees to basically deal with issues. Sometimes the people that aren't sitting on a subcommittee have no idea what's going on, or the papers go until we get it the day before we come to the meeting. If that subcommittee meeting is going to be done on a conference call, then there should be an opportunity for other governor's appointees, legislative appointees, or state directors, if they're sitting around, to be doing that. But the only way we can know about that if we get a notification that meeting is on. And again, put us on the mute button. We're not part of the subgroup, but at least we can listen to the discussion that's going on and make sure it's not hidden agendas or anything else going on. So it gives transparency to what's being discussed at both of those meetings. We feel more comfortable. I think since we seem to be doing a lot more of those conference call type things, I think we should have an open process on it.
Thank you, Tom. Dave Simpson?
Yeah, this is on the, voting on technical committees issue. I think generally in science, the direction of advisory bodies is to move, operate under consensus, not on voting, because it's not a political thing. I think EPA advisory groups, avoid votes. I think that's why we went from a, voting type of system to working toward consensus. And then if there's disagreement, you hope that, in this case, the technical committee brings those perspectives back to the board so that we can make the decision. But I'm not going to be more comfortable if I get science that is the technical committee advice by an 8-7 vote. That's not the nature of science to be voted upon yes or no. I guess the science is sort of evolutionary, but you can imagine if you move the calendar back, if there were a vote among scientists whether the Earth was round or flat, it probably at one point would have been, voted to be flat. and that would be the scientific advice. I don't think that's the way to move forward. So I'd prefer to stay away from the voting. I know it's frustrating at times, but it's difficult for technical people to stay away from the policy decisions. They get intertwined a lot, and I think the more you move toward voting, the more you encourage that sort of thing too. So my preference would be to stay with a consensus type approach.
Richie?
Well, I guess taking the other side of the coin, I would view having the vote as a protection for us that the politics aren't entering into it, and an 8-2 vote would be important for me. 8-7, I agree with you that would be hard. You'd hear the majority minority, but if I saw an 8-2 and I saw that the two votes were, let's say, in states that were benefited by a certain direction, I think that's important for us to know. So this hasn't come up much at all. So I don't think it's something that's going to be common, but it did come up in straight bass, and I think if we had had the vote, it might have saved us, a fair amount of time yesterday. There's a possibility of that. So,
Doug?
Just to make the full commissioners aware of what changed my mind on this, I was up until recently on board with staying as a consensus basis, but ran into a situation here where a decision needed to be made for a management action to be moved forward, and a decision needed to be made by the technical committee, and they couldn't reach a consensus, so there was no decision made. And if it hadn't been in that particular case, I asked the PDT to make the decision that the technical committee did make. And my concern is that if we rely on consensus and they cannot make a decision, and it inhibits our progress in managing the fishery. That's where when it came to that, I became very concerned about the consensus building process.
Yeah, a 9-0 technical committee vote is a pretty powerful thing. An 8-7 technical committee vote is a very powerful thing, in my opinion, because that tells me there's a problem that we need to address. And so, without consensus, you don't know. With just the consensus statement, you don't know. So, Kyle.
Yeah, and on those 8-7 votes, I think you still can get a consensus on what the feeling is of the committee. It doesn't have to come down on one side or the other, but the minority opinion in an 8-7 vote has just as much validity as the majority opinion. And I think that getting those two sides, instead of just saying we couldn't come to consensus, that doesn't help us. But to bring the 2 or 3 even side of an issue out, and that way we can go through the matter. So I think the vote kind of helps bring that out. But on the other hand, if it's not a voting actual vote, then it needs to have all sides of the issue on a consensus of saying this is what we discussed, at least.
Tom?
Yeah, thanks. I think my main point is whether it's consensus or a vote. I would really like to see the technical committee come forward with the basis of their discussions that better quantify what the levels of risk and uncertainty are with the options that they're considering. With the striped bass Bay reference point, I had a very difficult time figuring all that out, and I think the board did as well. And yes, there wasn't able to gain consensus, but I don't think I would really prefer, whether it's consensus or votes, that there's more information on what would be the level of risk to the resource and what's the level of uncertainty if the board does this or that. Ultimately, we got to make a policy decision, and we're not going to have the best available. We're always going to be imprecise in the science, but I think that information would better enable me in making the decisions. Thanks.
There is objection to going back to the voting protocol for the technical committee. So I need Dave.
I'll save us the pain of revisiting formally. I agree completely with what Tom said. I just was sharing that generally in the U.S., if not the world, scientists don't vote. You know, the Board of Physicians that reviews your case doesn't vote 3-2 that you should have the surgery or not. They usually do a little more for you, and I think the complete picture of all the minds that were put to that worked on the question, getting that feedback is really the key.
Then can we move forward? Okay. Yeah.
So we will update those guidance documents.
So we'll update those guidance documents and be sure and present what Doug reminded us of from the XCOM meeting this morning. I keep looking at the wrong agenda. Let me see here. The American eel enforcement efforts. Terry, you were going to give a 30-second brief on that, if possible.
Yes, sir. Just wanted to briefly report to the board that in 2014, the number of violations in Maine were down by 92%. In 2013, there are 289 summons and 41 warnings. This year, there are 39 summons and 31 warnings. The majority of the summonses were for no licenses. This year, there were also 16 summonses for exceeding the quota. Each one of those will not be fishing next year.
Thank you, Terry. Any questions for Terry? Seeing no, Spud's gone. I was going to get him to do a quick update on the awards committee. Spud not here. I'll come back to him real quickly. Bob, if you want to discuss the ASMFC support for non-ASMFC staff to attend conferences, educational and/or other career knowledge building courses. Sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, the brief background on this, and in the interest of time, is that leading up to the AFS meeting the week after next, I believe, we had a number of requests from state scientists for ASMFC to support their travel to Quebec City to attend the AFS meeting, and we didn't really have criteria on who we should send or shouldn't send, and who we should support and who we shouldn't. And you know, the rule we are using now, and I think it's appropriate, is that if somebody's traveling there in official ASMFC capacity, such as the technical committee chair, or they're presenting a paper directly as a product of a technical committee deliberation, then ASMFC can pick up the tab. If it's somebody that's just going there and they happen to be a member of the striped bass, the eel, the lobster technical committee, and there's a symposium on that subject, we probably can't afford to pick up their tab, even though it'd be great to have all of our tech folks there for symposia that deal with our species. So if everyone's okay with that sort of guideline, that we'll pick up the tab if somebody's traveling on more or less official ASMFC business and representing or presenting a paper that directly relates to ASMFC, we can cover their travel. You know, some meetings are relatively close. It's not a big deal. Some meetings are in Alaska or wherever they might be, and those get pretty expensive. Or Quebec City is actually expensive as well. So if everyone's okay with that approach, we'll keep doing that in the future.
Any questions, concerns about that? Seeing none, Spud, if you're prepared to give a brief update on the awards committee.
Excuse me. Many years ago, the commission established some guidelines for awards specific to technical staff, and that was done in recognition that through the conventional annual awards of excellence and the Hart Award, that some of the deserving folks in the technical disciplines were not getting recognized. Well, first person that got awarded that was a federal employee that could not accept the award because it was a conflict of interest, and they couldn't be sent to a meeting. And since that time, there's been no others, and in fact, the annual awards of excellence have really diversified in terms of the nominees to incorporate the technical folks. So it's the recommendation of the awards committee that we formally discontinue this technical award that's sort of been on the books but really hasn't been active.
Thank you, and without objection, we'll continue with that. All right. I wanted to real quickly brief you. I asked Bob to send out to the executive committee, and we can get this out to the entire commission, but last night I was served with a lawsuit by the North Carolina Fisheries Association and the Carteret County Commercial Fishermen's Association, suing me in my official capacity, my counterpart with the Wildlife Commission, the secretary of my department, as well as the head of NIMS, Fish and Wildlife Service, Interior, and Commerce, on our collective failure to adequately and appropriately address recreational interactions with sea turtles. And the remedy from the plaintiffs is essentially to ask for a population assessment of these turtles, but also in the interim to close the recreational fishery within the areas of jurisdiction of North Carolina and the federal councils, so essentially all the states on the East Coast at least, until an ITP is developed for the recreational fishery. So I know that could have very significant impacts from Florida to Virginia. I really don't know north of Virginia what kind of interactions with sea turtles they have north of Virginia. Probably not a whole lot, but I don't know. But it's just a serious issue that everyone should be at least keeping their ear to the ground on, and the potential impacts that they could have. I know that NIMS has already mobilized and begun discussing the case, as have folks in North Carolina. And what I may do is have our attorney with ASMFC take a look at the complaint as well and maybe provide some tidbits of information, because I think overall, I mean, it really involves almost all of us. So just a heads up, and we had a discussion about that this morning as well, so I just wanted to make sure y'all were aware of that discussion. Some folks think this is funny, knowing that the potential judge that could hear this case would not surprise me at all for him to enjoin the recreational fishery until an incidental take permit is accomplished, and I don't know how that would work. I'm probably as familiar with it as anybody in this room with observer programs and ITPs, and I can't get my head wrapped around how you would do a recreational incidental take permit and provide the observers that would be necessary to monitor that type of thing. So, Bill Adler?
Who sued you?
It was North Carolina Fisheries Association and the Carteret County Commercial Fishermen, so two groups from North Carolina. And I think the general concern there is the disproportionate impacts of complying with the Endangered Species Act by the commercial fishermen compared to the recreational fishermen. There doesn't seem to be I think their complaint is that there doesn't seem to be any concern over recreational interactions with endangered species or boat strikes as related to endangered species, but there are significant concerns and ITPs required and observers required in commercial fisheries where there are interactions with endangered species. And so it will be I think it'll be a very interesting case if it actually gets to court. So, but it could have significant impacts on a large component of the commission, so I wanted to make sure you were aware of that. And then one other item that I did not get to at the executive committee this morning, but I just wanted to give you a heads up. We are providing comments. I am providing comments to National Marine Fisheries Service over shark management, We requested, and I believe this board requested, that they not couple the black-nosed shark quota with the small coastal shark quota, because that acted as a choke species. And I don't know the exact numbers, but the quota on black-nosed sharks is about 50,000 pounds, and the quota on small coastals is about 700,000 to 800,000 pounds. And we warned them that we'd end up losing our small coastal fishery. That, as if you recall, when Tony put up the small coastal sharks, all three non-black-nosed coastal sharks are not overfished, and overfishing is not occurring. So North Carolina's lost about 30 to 50% of our small coastal shark fishery because of the closure. Because what they did was, as soon as the black-nosed quota was caught, they closed the whole thing. And so that raises a lot of concerns for us. What I'd like to know, and we don't have to, not for discussion here, but if you are in a state, particularly like Virginia, or any of the southern states, if you have a small coastal shark fishery, and the primary one I think would be sharp-nosed sharks, you may be interested in seeing this letter, and perhaps sending one on your own. We may be the only ones that have been significantly impacted by that, and if we are, but we don't have a shark board meeting this week, and it is a pretty significant issue. We also are going to discuss some of the smoothhound issues that are coming up through HMS. So don't want to belabor the point if we're the only state that's concerned about it, but I have a feeling there may be some other states that have some issues there and that have missed out and may want to participate in some discussions, since we don't have a board meeting this week. So I'll be around. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it offline. Dennis?
Dr. Daniels, why do you have so many problems?
Are we live streaming? I think we are. So I'm not. I can give you the answer I give to the legislators, and that is, we have this remarkable confluence of currents in North Carolina that give us all these different fisheries, and we also tend to be the less restrictive state on the East Coast in terms of opportunities for our fishermen, and that creates conflicts and concern and consternation, Senator, and that's one of the and when you're trying to manage recreational fish for quality and commercial fish for quantity, it's like managing deer herds for spikes and 12 pointers. You can't do it. So they tend to understand that. But yes, there are a lot of issues in North Carolina, and notwithstanding the lawsuit, which should make life interesting for the next, well, Paul said 5 years I may be dealing with this, so we'll see what happens there. I believe, and I'll turn to my wonderful vice chairman to add anything I missed from the XCOM meetings. I'm not sure if we're good. I think we covered it all. So I'd like to give you all those updates and heads ups and and thank you for providing all the feedback and comment. And again, I would invite you all to attend our executive committee meetings and be familiar. That might save us some time. We wouldn't have to go through this, but I know not everybody's going to come, so we'll continue to give these updates at the business session. Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quick, Bob, you and I engaged in an email exchange yesterday regarding the MRIP transition team issue, and you indicated you were going to perhaps bring it up at the XCOM. I'm not sure if this is an appropriate time. I just want to see if Bob has anything to offer on that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. We kind of ran out of time on that one this morning. But for all the state directors, if you remember, I sent you all an email, 10 days or so ago, asking for nominations to serve on a transition team for the MRIP program, transitioning from the old program to the new, and how can that be incorporated? How can those changes be incorporated in the data collection and the assessments and management? And the good news is I got a lot of nominations. The bad news is I got a lot of nominations, so I have to narrow it down to a few folks to serve on that. The other thing that's the other sort of moving part of this is the CDAR program in the Southeast is developing or putting on a workshop September 8, 9, and 10 dealing with MRIP calibration, and it's calibrating the old old site intercept survey with the data coming out of the old survey versus a new site intercept survey, and how can you calibrate that information? And there's a lot of differing things that have occurred from year to year, and how many of those are as a result of the new methodology versus changes in stock size and those sorts of things. So I was going to sit down with Lewis and the list of nominees and try to pick a few that represent north and south end of the coast, and technical knowledge as well as a little bit of managerial knowledge. And I've talked to Gordon about what good candidates might be like, and so hopefully we'll be able to narrow that list down.
All right. With that said, I think I've chaired all the meetings today, so I only have myself to blame for being 45 minutes late. For that, I apologize, but I do want to take, since this will be the last meeting I chair this week, and we've got the full commission here, I wanted to really quickly just let y'all know that the executive committee, under unanimous consent, and this is not up for discussion, agreed that our new executive director, Bob Beal, was doing an outstanding job, that he deserved. We're ranking our executive director as does not meet expectations, meets expectations, and exceeds expectations, and we all agreed that he has exceeded expectations for this year. And so I wanted to let you all know that we did a very thorough and rigorous review of his performance. We have made a couple of suggestions that we believe will help. One is he will begin to provide a bulleted list of goals and objectives for the next year, which we will see in October, and then after that each August. The other thing that I have asked him to do, and I met with Tony and he at lunch, and we had a very good discussion with Doug, is that we're going to start having staff put together basically a terms of reference memo for the technical committee that will be signed off on by the chairman of the board. So if you're a board chairman, at the end of the meeting, there will be whatever direction is given to the technical committee, it will be submitted to the technical committee with the chairman's name. And that way staff doesn't run into any conflicts with our state folks at the technical committees when they're trying to run those meetings. And we believe that that's a good approach. Hopefully it will help staff and make sure that it's clear to everybody where the directions are coming from and that they're coming from the board and not staff. So we agreed that we would move forward with that. So with that said, too, I wanted to take this chance at this review period to just say that any comments that you have, feel free to bring to me on the side or to Doug. But everything I'm hearing is extremely positive, both from the commissioners and from staff. I think staff seems to be very pleased with the performance of the commission, and it shows in their demeanor and it shows in their products. And I can't be complimentary enough of the folks that we've seen so far this week. Have been on point. They've been sharp. They've been, I mean, it's almost like they've been scripted to answer questions from the commission, and particularly speaking about, yesterday Mike and Katie did a yeoman's job with the striped bass board, and that's just a testament to not only the staff we have, but to Bob's leadership. So everybody, we all are very appreciative of Bob's efforts, and I just wanted to let you know how everything came out this year. So with that said, we will adjourn the business session of the commission, and we will start, if